To get a good sense of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the mysterious sect who composed them, a good starting point is a text known as the Damascus Rule, which contains the kind of ordinances and regulations needed for entire families, men, women, and children, living together in communal fashion. It seems purposefully suited to an assortment of communities in the cities and towns across ancient Judea where they had taken up residence. Oddly enough, it first came to light not at the ancient site of Qumran, but in the form of a medieval copy discovered in 1887 in the attic or geniza of an old synagogue in Cairo, Egypt. A geniza is a sealed-off chamber where old Hebrew texts are retired when they can no longer be used. The Ezra Synagogue had been renovated in the late 1800s, at which time the geniza had been opened. Solomon Schechter of Cambridge University personally traveled to Cairo to retrieve thousands of pages of these early Jewish manuscripts, one of which was a most unusual document, which, though tattered and in pieces, appeared to be a series of strict Jewish laws known as halakha. It was far more stringent than any compendium of Jewish law Schechter had ever seen, and he simply referred to it as fragments of a Zadokite work, since it made multiple references to the ancient Zadokite priesthood. No one knew where this text had originated until the mid-20th century, when fragments of the identical work were discovered in Qumran Cave 4. The fragments from Cairo dated to the 10th century, while these were fully 2 millennia old. It became obvious that the original text had been composed by the Dead Sea sect, a copy or copies of which somehow found their way across the trade routes to old Cairo, where they must have been copied and recopied, and ultimately deposited in the geniza of the Ezra Synagogue. Cairo happens to have been home to a sizable sect of very stringent medieval Jews known as the Karaites, and it is at least possible that they liked the stringency of this sectarian document and preserved copies of it for several centuries. In the end, the Karaites all but died out, and whatever texts they revered would likely have been retired to the geniza. The so-called Damascus Rule, as it is known today, results from piecing together both the Qumran fragments and the geniza fragments to produce a single text. Toward the beginning of the text, we find these mysterious words. Ve'yakam lahem moreh tzedek lahadrichem b'derech libo. Hercule Poirot of Agatha Christie fame here. The teacher of righteousness has never been identified in history, despite many attempts by many textual detectives to do so. Nowhere do any of the scrolls give him a name, only this cryptic title, which remains and probably always will remain an enigma in world religious history. The mysterious teacher might be a notable of Jerusalem, a member of the priestly aristocracy, well known to the general population. His background might well be one of power, prestige, and influence. His name may even be a household word to the people of Judea, but we will never know. One enigmatic passage in the scrolls gives us some important clues about him. ובקץ חרון שנים 390 לתיתו אותם ביד נבוכדנצר מלך בבל פקדם. The reference is to the destruction of the kingdom of Judah by the Babylonians in the year 586 BCE. This year is firmly fixed in the minds of the Judeans, along with the fact that their people are preserved and return after 70 years of exile to their long-abandoned homes. Some 390 years after the Babylonian conquest, during the Age of Wrath, when the wicked Syrians, including Antiochus Epiphanes, dominate the land of Israel. A mysterious visitation of God takes place. The year is 196 BCE, just 2 years after Syria swallows up little Judea. Bear in mind that for roughly a century, 300 to 200 BCE, Egypt and Syria fought back and forth, with Judea caught in the middle. For most of the 3rd century BCE, Egypt prevailed, ruling over the Judeans, largely leaving them alone. But in 198 BCE, the tide turned, and Judea found itself in the grip of the Seleucid dynasty of Syria, a monarchy with a very different autocratic character. What kind of visitation is this? In the words of the scroll's text, "Vayitzmach meYisrael u'meAharon shoresh mita'at lirosh et arzo uledashen b'tov adamato v'yavinu ba'onam v'yed'u ki anashim mashimim hem v'yiyu ke'ivrim u'chimegasheshim derech." Could the teacher of righteousness be the plant root? Could the ancient scroll be telling us that the teacher was born in the year 196 BCE? If so, he would have been 28 years old when the Maccabees begin their revolt against Syria, and 32 years old when Jerusalem is retaken and the Hasidim retire to their wilderness retreat. But who are these blind men groping for the way for a period of 20 years? Perhaps they are the original congregation of pietistic Jews struggling to maintain their faith in the face of great oppression until the teacher comes to the fore, revealing himself as their deliverer, a second Moses, as it were, and leading them on an exodus into the searing heat of the Judean desert. Until the teacher, there was no great mystical master, no one to guide the righteous remnant, and they were, in fact, like blind men groping in the darkness. The Damascus Rule likewise speaks of a congregation of traitors who departed from the way. And then it adds, "Ba'amod ish halatzon asher hetif liYisrael mimeh kazav v'yita'em betohu lo darach lehaseach gvohot olam ulasur minetivot tzedek ulasiya gvul asher gavlu rishonim b'nachalatam." A conspiracy has apparently been spearheaded by a fellow priest who has removed the boundary and led all Israel astray. Bavur asher darshu b'chalakot v'yivcharu b'mahatlot v'yitzpu lefartzut v'yivcharu b'tov hatzavar v'yatzdiku rasha v'yarshiu tzadik v'ya'aviru brit v'yafiru chok. Whoever these wayward Israelites are, they are apparently too lax in their observance of the Torah. The term seekers of smooth things appears repeatedly in the Dead Sea Scrolls and suggests a lack of stringency. The text also declares, "V'yagudu al nefesh tzadik uv'chol holche tamim ta'ava nafsham v'yirdafum lacherev." Some deduce that this refers to the persecution of the teacher of righteousness and his followers. Others suggest that we have a motif here, suggestive of the gospel narratives of the sufferings of Jesus. There has even been an attempt to late date the scrolls to the 1st century CE, making them contemporaneous with Jesus. And that, of course, flies in the face of both carbon-14 and paleographic evidence, which points to at least the 1st century BCE as the date of the Qumranic composition. As for the identity of this scoffer, we might deduce that he is the same as the so-called wicked priest. Furthermore, there is a good bet that we know the exact identity of this wicked priest, historically. A man who has earned himself a place in infamy and who will provoke a cosmic confrontation between the forces of good and evil on the battleground of antiquity. And these clues have to fit if a historical identification is to be made. We know this about the arch nemesis of the teacher of righteousness. He is a priest of Israel. He is most likely the high priest, as the spiritual overseer and shepherd of the entire tribe of Levi, who will render bloody service to the Almighty by offering a sacrifice at the temple. He has led all Israel astray through his lies and by removing the boundary. He has led others to seek smooth things. He has brought down the wrath of God by condemning the just. But what does this scroll mean by this strange phrase, removing the boundary? Consider the fact that the temple in Jerusalem is a most exclusive place, a habitation for God, not human beings. The most holy place, the small chamber containing the fabled Ark of the Covenant, may be entered only by the high priest, and only designated priests chosen by lot are allowed to enter even the outer sanctuary. The exterior courts of the temple are open to Israelites alone, and no one who is a non-Jew is to be found within the temple precincts. A special balustrade, a low wall called the soreg, the boundary, completely surrounds the outer courtyard of the structure, and an inscription declares that any who violate its sanctity are liable to the penalty of death. Another kind of boundary exists in these days, dividing the high priesthood from the ordinary priests. Only those from a single family, the sons of Tzadok, are eligible to become high priests. All other priests are barred from this office by birth. There comes to be an exception, however. A priest, one of the 5 sons of Mattathias, the patriarch of the Jewish freedom fighters of the 2nd century BCE, known as the Maccabees. This son of Mattathias, in seeking to establish an independent Judean kingdom, receives, through skillful political alliance, the office of high priest. He is called Jonathan the Maccabee. And he comes not from the house of Tzadok, the high priestly family, but rather from the house of Hashmon, a family of ordinary priests from the town of Modi'in. But never mind the technicalities. He removes the boundary. He effectively usurps the high priesthood with all its attendant power, authority, and prestige. He becomes de facto head of the new Judean kingdom, acting not only as head priest, but as head of the nation, a veritable king. Might Jonathan the Maccabee be the identity of the wicked priest? If we deduce that he is, then in the eyes of the teacher of righteousness, it is anathema. It is an abomination, not unlike the abomination of desolation, inflicted upon the temple and the people by Antiochus Epiphanes. Is Jonathan the Maccabee prepared to flaunt the laws of God in the interest of national liberation? Will he sink to the level of his enemy by defiling the temple and its boundary? This son of Mattathias has no right, by heavenly or earthly authority, to grab the priesthood in a power play designed to further his own selfishly political objectives. And the rest of the priesthood has no mandate to support him in his egotistical ends. An open letter, an epistle of the teacher pieced together from the multitude of scroll fragments and known as MMT, Miktzat Ma'aseh Torah, is quite possibly addressed directly to this wicked priest, Jonathan the Maccabee. It highlights the reasons that the sect separated itself, and it deserves serious scrutiny in its own right. We should also consider that the Hebrew for chief priest is Kohen HaRashi, and for wicked priest is Kohen ha-Rasha. The whole controversy may seem to hinge on an inconsequential point, the preeminence of one Levitical family over another. But for those whose purpose was obeying, line upon line and precept upon precept, the commandments of Scripture, it's a matter of grave concern. In essence, this bold coup of Jonathan's and the acquiescence of the ordinary priests in it invalidates the entire Jerusalem priesthood and even the temple which they serve. As far as the teacher is concerned, the temple is just as defiled now as during the days when the dark wing of the abomination of desolation hung over it. The divine service is invalid. The sacrifice itself is null and void. There is no atonement here. This is why they must live in the wilderness. This is why they must substitute their spontaneous outpourings of prayer for the temple sacrifice. This is why their community must become, in effect, a new Jerusalem, an alternate society preparing the way. The ancient historian Josephus indicates that in the years 159 to 152 BCE, immediately before Jonathan the Maccabee came to power, there was no one holding the office of high priest. But a passage in the book of Maccabees, 1 Maccabees 10, suggests that there was in fact a high priest holding the office prior to Jonathan. This gives rise to speculation that the teacher of righteousness was in fact the high priest in Jerusalem until he was forcibly ejected by Jonathan and his army. This is nothing more than conjecture, but it would certainly explain why the teacher would call Jonathan the wicked priest. Along with being branded a liar and spouter of lies, the Dead Sea Scroll called the Habakkuk Commentary declares that this man was once called by the name of truth. At the last judgment, says the Habakkuk Commentary, he will empty the cup of the wrath of God. Of course, there are many in Israel who don't see things in the same way as the teacher. The popular Jonathan is still a hero in their eyes, and they support him instinctively. It appears that some kind of conflict arose between the teacher and his adherents and other members of the sect, who we might guess may have been in league with the breaker of the boundary, theorized to have been the Hasmonean high priest, Jonathan. We don't know the details of the conflict or how it plays out at the Dead Sea settlement where the community has been residing. Is the conflict limited to sharp words and verbal harangues? Is there physical violence? Is there bloodshed? As we've seen, the haunting language of the Damascus Rule does hint at violence. The precise details are lost to us, but there is a possible scenario we can imagine. The teacher of righteousness seems to have been overpowered. He and his closest followers, referred to as all who walked in perfection, are forced to leave their desert haven. They must face the bitterness of exile. But where will they go? They can hardly go back to Jerusalem, the holy city, which they had long abandoned. Jerusalem is in the hands of Jonathan the Maccabee. They must go someplace far away, beyond the grasp of the powerful Hasmonean priest. The teacher decides to flee to the north, following the path of the vast Jordan Rift Valley. The Damascus Rule hints at such a possibility, as well as the possibility that some subsequently fell away. Ken kol ha'anashim asher ba'u b'brit ha'chadasha ba'eretz Damasik v'shavu v'yivgedu v'yasuru mi'be'er ha'mayim ha'chayim lo yachashvu besod am. The Damascus Rule loudly proclaims the ultimate fate of the rebellious spirits in the camp. Im anshe haratzon yishaftu, ki davru tva'ah al chukei hatzedek, uma'asu bebrit, va'amna asher kiyamu, be'eretz Damasik, v'hu brit ha'chadasha. But we might surmise that the true disciples of the teacher believe that their arch nemesis, the high priest Jonathan, will never find them in this secluded city deep in the realm of Syria. For them, it is a city of refuge of sorts, not unlike the biblical cities of refuge set aside for those accused of murderous wrongdoing. But the best hopes of this faithful remnant are soon to be proved wrong. Details are sparse, but it is clear that the beloved teacher of righteousness is stalked and tracked down. The wicked priest, assuming him to be Jonathan, who caused them to wander in a pathless wilderness, laying low the everlasting heights, now dispatches a raiding party across that same wilderness to seek and destroy his priestly opponent. Bear in mind that virtually every angle of the Dead Sea Scrolls is being debated, and some even feel that Damascus is a code word for the Dead Sea settlement of Qumran. In other words, the teacher and his flock may have fled not from Qumran to Damascus, but from Jerusalem, where the sect began, to Qumran, that is Damascus, in their mind. Certainly, many of the terms in the scrolls are deeply symbolic, but most responsible scholars believe that when the scrolls say Damascus, they literally mean Damascus. Some things, of course, we will never know. The disciples of the martyred teacher have a distinctive way of referring to his death. They call it his gathering in. The murder of the teacher is for them a great prophetic landmark which must take place before the dawning of a better day. They declare, "Umiyom ha'asaf yoreh hayachid ad tom kol anshe hamilchama asher shavu im ish hakazav keshanim arbaim." But what is this 40 years? Is it understood as a literal time period or merely a symbolic period from the teacher's death to the Messianic age? The text also declares that those who betray the new covenant shall not be counted among the congregation or written in its holy book. Miyom ha'asaf moreh hayachid ad amod Mashiach me'Aharon u'me'Yisrael. And here we have another issue. Are we talking about one Messiah or two? One priestly, that is from the house of Aaron, and a lay Messiah from Israel at large. On this and so many other issues, the jury is still out.